champagne since 1991. This is an actual bottle of the 1997 Blanc de Blanc that was awarded Best Champagne in the World in 2001 in Paris, France at the Vitalise Internationalis. And as hard as it is to believe, it was grown and produced right here in Pennsylvania, and we're going to show you how. This is where our visitors experience the tasting of our wines, and that includes champagnes, white wines, red wines, and ice wines. And normally this is the only room our visitors see. But today we're going to take you into the back workspaces of our small winery and show you how we make champagne. It's June and we're starting the process of making champagne called Methode Champenoise, and we're going to take you through the many steps it takes to make champagne. In this tank is approximately 300 gallons of Chardonnay wine that we grew, pressed, and fermented last fall. And this is called the base wine and is used to make champagne. And the first step is to create a multiplication of yeast cells called a yeast starter. To do that, we take dry yeast powder, something like this, and through the process of creating a starter, we make it many thousand-fold the number of cells so that it can create 300 gallons into 1,500 bottles of champagne. And we'll show you the yeast starter next. The making of the yeast starter occurs right here in the winery kitchen behind me. And we're going to show you the steps of that process. It's going to be in low light because that is the best for the yeast. The winemaking process is all about fermenting the juice of the wine grape using wine yeast. It's called fermentation. And the byproduct of fermentation is alcohol and CO2. And the champagne making process, Methode Champenoise, uses that process of fermentation in the bottle to create the bubbles. They're called the effervescence. To make Methode Champenoise, we have to create a yeast starter, a multiplication of many yeast cells to create all those bubbles in the bottle. And we're going to show you now the pieces of how we create that yeast starter. And the first step is we have a base wine here in this container, and to it we're going to add some sweetened distilled water. To do that, we use basic table sugar dissolved in water. And the next step is to get the yeast rehydrated. How we do that is that we heat distilled water to a temperature of 105 degrees. And we use a thermometer like this to measure that. Once the temperature is correct, we add our selected wine yeast, which is in dry powder form, to the distilled water. And we mix it up. Now we're going to cover it and allow it to sit for 10 minutes. 10 minutes has elapsed, so the yeast rehydration has completed. And now we're going to take that yeast, and you can kind of see it looks real creamy, and add this to our container. Now we've completed putting the yeast starter in, we'll do one more thing, and that is we'll agitate the container to make sure it's thoroughly mixed. Cover it up, keep it in the dark, and wait until tomorrow for our next step. It's been 24 hours since we began the yeast starter. It's been sitting basically in the dark, covered, so the yeast cells can multiply. Now we'll do a final addition of sugar water to give the yeast something to eat. We'll shake it up and hopefully you can hear the yeast growing. Our yeast starter is ready. We have made 15 gallons of yeast starter. That's 5 gallons for every 100 gallons of base wine we're going to turn into champagne. Now we will pump 300 gallons of base wine into this tank and add 3 containers of yeast starter. That equals 15 gallons of yeast starter into this container. In addition, we'll add some yeast nutrients to help the yeast on their job, and sugar calculated by formula so the yeast have something to eat in the champagne bottle to produce all those bubbles. Our base wine and yeast starter mixture is now ready to be pumped into this 6-spout filler to fill the champagne bottles. And how we do that is we fill each bottle on the filler. When it is full, it is then put here in the capper machine, which runs on compressed air, and puts a crown cap on the top of the champagne bottle to complete the closure. Champagne bottles, after capping, now are going to be stacked into these metal cages. The secondary fermentation in the bottle will occur over a 3-week period of time. Then we store them, stack them, and they essentially are stored to develop complexity in the bottle in these cages for over 5 years. This champagne bottle has been sitting in the cages for 5 years. The fermentation completed after approximately 3 weeks, and the sediment is the result of that second fermentation in the champagne bottle with the yeast nutrients that we added, which helped to develop the famous complexity in our champagne. This sediment in the bottom of the bottle now has to be moved into the cap for removal, and that process is called riddling, and we're going to show you that next. Now we'll show you how we load the bottles into the riddling machine. I've already loaded the bottom layer here. It has 3 layers for a total of 150 bottles. We keep the bottle in the horizontal position with the sediment on the bottom. And we're going to use the cap of this bottle and nest it into the bottom layer using the punt on the champagne bottle. The riddling rack is now loaded and ready to go. We will attempt to take pictures of the motion as it occurs over the next 7 days. Day 1. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. Day 5. Day 6. Day 7. And this is the result of the riddling process. you can see that the bottle is clear. The sediment has all moved down here into the cap. And then next we will show you the process of removing the cap and the sediment coming out of the bottle. You're all familiar with how champagne is the symbol of celebrating glorious achievements. But as you're about to see, there is no glory in making champagne. On your left, you see champagne stored in these metal racks. And the yellow picking bins in the winery are used to store finished champagne, ready to label and for sale. This is the bottom of our 1830s stone barn. And here you can see some of the original beams. This barn is partially underground and provides perfect working temperature for storing champagne and for finishing it as it stays in the winter below 40 degrees. And here we have our champagne finishing line, and we're going to show you next how we do that. The next step in the process is called disgorgement. Disgorgement is where the sediment is removed from inside the champagne bottle. And this is the machine that assists us in doing that. The bottle is dropped into the machine and a sensor activates this motion. The next step in the process, now that the sediment has been removed, is to add the finishing liqueur or the dosage. It's a secret recipe of each champagne house, and it's the finishing liquid that gets added to each bottle of champagne. We do that with a syringe and add a small amount to each bottle. That liquid then determines the residual sugar for the classification of champagne on the label. So now we're ready for the cork, and the wire hood. That's the final steps. Now we're ready to put the label on the bottle. We have a specialized piece of equipment from Italy that puts self-adhesive labels on the champagne bottle. The finishing step is putting the foil on top of the champagne bottle with a machine called the pleater. And in conclusion, since tomorrow is promised to no one, why not celebrate today?